Language these days, of course, has been heavily influenced by social media. So we all got used to Brexit, and I think you all know that Brexit means the decision of the United Kingdom public, a majority thereof, that we should leave the European Union. India Ref 2, however, may not be quite so familiar to you, because I suspect the discourse of Scottish politics doesn't regularly reach quite as far as East Anglia. So India Ref 2 refers to the possibility that Scotland might hold another referendum on whether or not it should become an independent country and therefore leave the United Kingdom. And basically what I want to talk about is what are the prospects that the Brexit decision will lead to a decision to hold India Ref 2, and if so, what might happen as a result. Now, I'm anticipating that for this audience at least I need to give a little quick historical lesson so that you realise fairly rapidly why the UK-wide vote to leave the European Union has such potential implications for the independence debate north of the border. Well, the first thing you need to realise is that since the late 1980s or so, the SNP's vision of independence has been a vision of independence in Europe. Before that, the SNP was, if anything, an anti-EU party, and in the 1975 referendum, the SNP actually campaigned for the UK to leave the common market. But for the last 25 years or so, the SNP's vision of independence has been of independence in Europe. And the kind of language that's been used, for example, is that by becoming an independent country, Scotland could claim its own place at the top table of the European institutions, viz. Above all, the European Council. So, therefore, you need to understand that the debate about sovereignty in Scotland is framed very, very differently from the debate in England. In England, the sovereignty debate was, why does Brussels boss us around? This is not fair, this is not legitimate. In Scotland, in contrast, being part of the European Union has come to be regarded by the nationalist movement as one of the ways by which the nationalist aspirations that they have can actually be facilitated and implemented. So being in Europe is a way of enhancing Scotland's sovereignty, not as a restraint on it. Still, what you then need to realise is that the Unionists, i.e. those who were campaigning for Scotland to remain inside the United Kingdom, in what I've called India Ref 1, that's the September 2014 referendum, that one of their key arguments, it was an enormous debate during the referendum campaign, which was that the only way to ensure that Scotland remained inside the European Union, which is what the SNP claimed it wanted to do, was by voting no, because if Scotland voted yes, it would have to apply for membership of the European Union afresh as a new country. That obviously is pretty important given what's happened in the last 2 years. Now, in the event, Scotland voted no to independence by around 55% to 45%, so it kind of accepted the Unionist cause. Meanwhile, in the general election of 2015 and the Scottish Parliament election of 2016, the SNP said it would only consider holding a second independence referendum if there was, quote, a significant and material change in circumstances. You might think, however, given what was said in the campaign, that given that a decision of the UK to leave the European Union might be regarded as a significant and material change in circumstance as compared with the position in September 2014. And certainly, as we all know, Scotland voted very differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, which of course is not just simply a question about, hang on, the Unionists were telling us the opposite 2 years previously. But also, if you wanted to come up with a way of most dramatically and obviously giving credence to the nationalist belief that by remaining part of the United Kingdom, Scotland is perpetually at risk of seeing its democratic wishes, the wish of a majority of people in Scotland, to determine their future, that is always at risk because its votes can be overturned by the outcome in England. No better illustration. So, apart therefore, as it were, from appearing a question of broken promises, here is a clear illustration of the core, central, existentialist, nationalist argument. So you might therefore also anticipate that this might do something for support for independence. So that's the first bit of backdrop you need to understand. The second bit of backdrop you need to understand, which may not be obvious from simply knowing that the result was 55% to 45%, is that the yes side won the independence the IndyRef 1 campaign. At the beginning of the referendum, support for independence, depending on how you measure it, was somewhere in the 30%. It ended up at 45. Here's one illustration. This is from Scottish Social Attitudes. It's not using the independence referendum question, and the level of support for independence are lower. But what you need to note, if you can see it, far right-hand side, you're looking at the last 2 or 3 years before 2015, which is the first post-independence reading, and support in 2012, when the referendum is kind of being called, 23% on this measure. By the end, 39%. So however you look at it, the yes campaign, the consequence of holding IndyRef 1, contrary to the expectations of unionists, which was, why did the UK government agree? To get rid of the sword of Damocles, to get rid of the constant threat that Scotland might say, we want to leave you unless you give us X, Y, and Z. Instead, it strengthened the sword of Damocles, and it left Scotland a seriously divided country on its constitutional preferences. What happened since September 2014? Basically nothing. These are all the readings of support for how people would vote in IndyRef 2 between September 2014 and June the 23rd of last year. As you can see, most, though not all, polls have no ahead, but only narrow ahead. Basically, on average in these polls, 53% for the Union, 47% for independence. Leaves us in a position where the SNP, from their point of view, frustratingly, they can win every election in Scotland, but they can't deliver the unique selling proposition. But equally, a level of support for independence that means that no unionist can possibly sleep terribly easily in their beds at night. Neither side in a position to be sure of being able to deliver their strategic objectives so far as the future territorial integrity of the UK is concerned. Okay, next thing you need to know is to understand the Scottish Government's reaction to the Brexit decision, which was encapsulated in a white paper that they released literally about 5 days before Christmas. I'm not sure they wanted anybody to read it, because, but there we go. Or if they were reading it through an alcoholic haze. That paper had 3 very clear positions. Number 1, our first preference. They laid out their vision for the kind of Brexit that they wanted. And it was, we stay in the single market, and by the way, we think freedom of movement is lovely. There was never any chance of that being the UK government's position. Theresa May had already said enough to make that clear, and on Tuesday we learned that certainly wasn't the UK government's position. Second preference, crucially, and this is not an idea that's simply come from the SNP, it's all been articulated by some unionists, which is that the UK should seek for Scotland to be able to remain in the single market, even if the rest of the UK is not, and that it should be able to continue the freedom of movement provisions. Now, to do this, you have to change the devolution settlement, you'd have to devolve immigration policy within the UK, the Scottish Government would have to be given the right to make international agreements, but they said, look, if you do this, we're still willing to kind of play ball with the UK government. Now, the UK government has poured large amounts of cold water on this, but haven't as yet quite had the courage to say no, not least, I suspect, because they know the moment they say no, the SNP will say, look at these sods, why should we play on with them? Meanwhile, there's a fallback position. The fallback position, which was first articulated by Nicola Sturgeon on June the 24th, is that IndyRef 2, the possibility of holding it, is on the table, by which he means I might or I might not hold a referendum. Hey, maybe you want to give me something to ensure that I don't. There is another side to this, however, which makes the SNP's pitch to potentially slightly more difficult. And this has already been referred to, which is that leaving Brexit, leaving the EU, opens up the prospect of more devolution. It's not just agriculture and fish and environment's already been mentioned. It's also, for example, it would be possible to devolve VAT to Scotland. Can't do it at the moment because of EU rules. You can devolve corporation tax, and Scotland can have the lowest corporation tax it wants if it wants. Again, EU rules will no longer apply. So there's actually the possibility of having a more stronger devolution settlement, and watch how far the unionists might exploit that position in future. Okay, so, however, the Scottish Government has a problem, and the SNP has a problem. The SNP are wont to say, look, 62% of people voted for Remain, and by the way, every single one of the 32 local authorities in Scotland voted for Remain, giving the impression that everybody in Scotland voted to remain. Oh, no, they didn't. And crucially, Brexit was as disruptive of the nationalist movement in Scotland as it was of the Labour Party, as it was of the Conservative Party, as it was of every single political movement in the UK apart from UKIP. These are figures from one source, other figures the figure. As you can see, according to this evidence, yes, those who voted no in the independence referendum in September 2040 were somewhat less likely to vote for Remain, but actually around a third of those people who voted no in September 2014 actually voted to leave. So while on the one hand, there may be some people out there who are going, oh, well, look, if the choice is between the UK outside the EU and Scotland in, actually I'm sufficiently committed to the EU that I'll go for an independent Scotland. There may also be people out there who go, well, actually, if the UK's got the darn good sense to leave the European Union, then actually I might stick with the UK after all. The first group is undoubtedly relatively limited. This is one survey that asked no voters, which matters more to you, being in the UK or being inside the European Union? UK wins, hands down. So there are not that many people who are going to be immediately so affronted by the decision of the UK to leave that they're necessarily going to change their minds. And what have we actually seen since? Well, actually, the opinion polls since the June the 23rd, very initially, 2 or 3 polls done immediately after June the 23rd suggested there had been a swing to yes, but since we're back to actually 55%, 45%. There hasn't been the shift in the balance of public opinion that the SNP were anticipating. Why? Well, it's true. As I've suggested, some people have switched from no to yes. I'm showing here some polling data that shows you that before June the 23rd, nearly 90% of people who voted no said they'd vote no again, and that figure has now got down to rather closer to 80%. But equally, whereas before June the 23rd, around 90% of people who voted yes said they'd do so again, that figure has also fallen to somewhat closer to 80%. In other words, there are indeed yes leavers or ex-yes leavers who are now no leavers because they would prefer to stay in the European Union. And then one other thing to note, I mean, Michael quite rightly said that immigration isn't such a big an issue in Scotland, but you know what, I'm not quite sure if I were Nicola Sturgeon, I'd want to fight a referendum campaign on the basis, vote for independence so we can have more Poles coming to Scotland. Here's some data on attitudes towards immigration in Scotland. Yes, fewer people in Scotland say that there should be less immigration, but the proportion of people who want lower immigration is still 43%, and therefore there is still a substantial constituency of people in Scotland for whom also the immigration issue is something of concern. Okay, so to conclude, why, as it were, frankly, you don't want to be Nicola Sturgeon or Theresa May in current circumstances, even if you had an aspiration to be so. Number one, the IndyRef 1 settled very little. It resulted in increased support for independence and left Scotland divided on how it should be governed. The EU referendum looks like the perfect illustration of the core nationalist argument, except that there has always been a body of nationalist opinion in Scotland that did not accept the elite SNP argument that we want to get rid of London rule in order to have Brussels rule. They're true nationalists. They don't want anybody, either London or Brussels, having a say in Scotland, and they voted to leave. And meanwhile, not that many no voters actually prioritised the EU over the Union. So therefore, we've had voters moving in both directions. Brexit has made a difference, but the balance of opinion is left the same. It means that we are still in this situation where if Nicola Sturgeon does decide to call a referendum, she said it won't be this year, but it could be next year, it's a tough call. It looks as though the compromises she's looking for on Brexit aren't going to happen, so therefore she doesn't seem to have much room for manoeuvre, but she can't be sure that she'd win a second referendum. But equally, Theresa May can't assume that she won't.